So good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome back to day 2 of this year's European 5G conference. So we had a really interesting day yesterday, 5 packed sessions yesterday, covering lots of the key topics relating to 5G. And a quick reminder before we start today to let you all know that the recordings for all of those sessions are now available to download. So if you did miss any of those sessions or wanted to watch anything back, then all of those are available for you to do that. There's a link for you to be able to access those in the reception area on the main platform, and you should also have received an email yesterday evening with the details of the link as well. So please do feel free to go and watch those again if you'd like to. So we had over 700 of you on the platform yesterday in total, which is fantastic, and we really do appreciate all of the questions, all of the comments that came in from you out there in the audience. Please do continue with that today. I think we had, across all of the sessions, we had a lot of questions yesterday, and really do appreciate it. It really helps the debate flow when we have those questions and things coming in from the audience. So please do continue to add your questions and your comments using the chat bar on the right-hand side of the screen. In all of the sessions today, we have time built in for those to be then taken and passed across to the moderators, who will address those to our panelists. So please do continue to add your comments and your questions using the chat on the right-hand side of the screen. So on to today. Before we start, I'd like to once again say a big thank you to all of our sponsor and our partner organizations, whose logos you can see next to me on the screen here. We really appreciate all of their support, and the event wouldn't be possible without that. So thank you all very much for your involvement and your support. To mention as well as the live sessions running here on the main plenary stage, we do have an on-demand area which you'll be able to access using the left-hand menu on the main event platform. And we have 5 showcase sessions running on that on-demand area that are available for you to watch throughout the whole duration of the event. So the showcase sessions, for those of you who aren't familiar with that, they're sessions that are led by some of our sponsor and partner organizations, and offer the opportunity to go into a bit more depth on some of the key themes that are covered in the plenary sessions themselves. So 5 sessions that we have running there. As I said, they'll be live for the duration of the event. So please do go and check those out, maybe during lunch or during one of the breaks. And you can see the 5 sessions that we have running throughout the event, as I say. Next on to the proceedings for today. So we're going to be starting very shortly with a focus on vertical connectivity and looking at powering the enterprise of the future. Before we're moving to look at mid-band frequencies for 5G and looking at kind of the meeting increasing needs for various users in those bands. Before we then move on to look at maybe a bit further forward to how the connectivity landscape is evolving, looking at new spectrum bands, new technologies, new approaches. And then we're going to finish off today with 2 sessions, one focusing on digital equality. So looking, I guess, at rural connectivity, but more broadly how we can deliver the target of 5G connectivity for all by 2030. And then we're going to look more at the urban areas and delivering densification to finish off with our final session today. And then once we've had all of the sessions, we're going to be closing with our It's a Wrap session, which is going to be hosted by Awea. So that's going to be our final conclusion session. We're going to be hearing from a number of our speakers on what their takeaways are from the event. Also the opportunity for all of you to give your takeaways and to give your final thoughts on the event. And we are delighted to be welcoming back the Sweetbeats, a band who's been with us for this event last year and also at our European Spectrum Conference in June last year, who are going to be playing some live music for us to wrap things up and help us close the event. So that's all coming up towards the end of the day today. But as I said, we're going to be starting off, first of all, with our first session of the day, which is going to be focusing on powering the enterprises of the future and asking what the best approach is to meet vertical connectivity needs around Europe. So delighted to have an excellent lineup of speakers with us for this session. So it's my pleasure to now welcome to the stage our moderator, who will tell us more and introduce those speakers. And that's Soren Sorensen from NERA. Soren, welcome. Great to have you with us. And as I said, really looking forward to this session. So I will pass over to you to open things and introduce our speakers. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this day 2 of the European 5G conference. So my name is Soren Sorensen. I'm an associate director at NERA Economic Consulting, and I'll be moderating this first session. So this session, as Dan mentioned, is focused on industry verticals. And we're going to be discussing what the best approach is to meet vertical connectivity needs and also how this best can be delivered. I find this a fascinating policy area, primarily because what we're seeing is a very wide variety of approaches across Europe. And I find this a bit striking since, most of us governed by the same EU framework. So you might have thought that, there was going to be a bit more, harmonization in this area going on. In a way, you can see what's going on as sort of a natural laboratory where, different approaches are being tried. And in a way, we're still learning, what to do, which approach to take. And of course, I'm hoping to learn even more during this session. So let's move into it. Quickly on those of you who did not attend yesterday. So the format we're following in this session is each of our 5 panelists, they have 7 minutes introductory talk. And then we turn to questions. And as Dan mentioned, you can all ask questions in the chat functionality. So our first panelist is Eric Fournier. He's a Director of Spectrum Planning and International Affairs at the National Frequency Agency in France. And Eric is also chair at the RSPG. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Soren, and good morning to everyone. So that's part of 5G verticals, spectrum needs. It has been mentioned already yesterday that the success of 5G will also be the success of the way to accommodate verticals within 5G. And that's why there are a lot of discussions at the European level in RSPG and also at the national level on how to ensure that we meet the spectrum need of verticals. Next slide, please. So I will focus on this specific spectrum needs, which is for local coverage. I will not speak about some other issues like spectrum slicing. That's an issue in itself and which does not really call for additional spectrum or specific spectrum solution. So local coverage for 5G verticals, it's for industry, obviously, 4.0, the transport logistics, the media entertainment, the agriculture, and many other where the coverage, the requirement for application is locally limited. Harmonization for that is perceived as very important because we're not speaking about smartphone. We are speaking about sometimes small device which may not have all set of bands which are used in Europe, including in the device. It's often mentioned that for meeting this vertical local need, we need to have some license spectrum. That could be more. Because quality of service performance is something which may be more important for some vertical than for others. So we may need to address both. RSPG on that, in its opinion, on the additional spectrum need, recognize first the kind of difficulty we may have in Europe for the mid-band, where the spectrum requirement for local coverage was addressed in a dissimilar way, and also recommended some actions. First, to have some studies regarding the 3842 gigahertz, where vertical needs, local coverage may be addressed in full sharing with the incumbent user, which are the receiving earth stations of the fixed satellite service. And also is pushing for looking at some options to address the same kind of vertical needs in the millimeter wave, whatever it's 26 gigahertz or 42 gigahertz. Next slide, please. So the situation in France, back to France. For the mid-band, we have the 2.6 gigahertz, the center gap, the TDD part of the 2.6 gigahertz, which is open for local coverage. There's some possibility to get a license, local license to ARCEP, the French regulator. And of course, there's an interest for studying these options in 3842 gigahertz, but with special care for us, it's extremely important in France to insist on the fact that the sharing should be real sharing. There's kind of perception from satellite community that once 5G is entering one way or another in a frequency band, the band could be lost by the existing incumbent. This is clearly what should not be the situation in the frequency band 3842. That's for real sharing, enabling also the future evolution of the incumbent services receiving earth stations. We are also looking, because we have expression of demand, some solutions for spectrum in unlicensed band, 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi for Wi-Fi technology, or for new radio unlicensed technology, and of course there are some demand for the 26 gigahertz and some interest from vertical side. There was trials which are still ongoing in France in this frequency band. Next slide, please. In Europe, the Commission has followed very rapidly the recommendation from RSPG and has issued a mandate to CEPT regarding the frequency band 3842 to try to reach an harmonization in this frequency band for local area coverage vertical. That's clearly limited to low medium power, which is complying with what is the need of vertical. And at the same time, that's what will make the sharing possible with the incumbent user. The protection of the incumbent is really emphasized in the text of the mandate, and CEPT launched the work in response of this mandate. Some possible additional action, and that's something which will be proposed by France very soon in the CEPT activity, is to try to see whether we can introduce what is called in the United States standard power for the 6 gigahertz, which would enable some outdoor usage with 1 watt, 4 watts, and of course under the control of automatic frequency coordination tool, like it was defined in North America, the United States, and Canada. And that's still also the question of vertical in millimeter wave. There's no real action for the time being, but very clearly we need to define some best practice on how to ensure that verticals will be able to use this millimeter wave for specific application. Next slide, please. Just back on 3842, because that's the immediate topic, which will be under study until 2024. The harmonization is for 2024. It's a kind of operations of verticals in wide space of the earth stations. You could imagine something like bandwidths up to 100 megahertz for vertical in this frequency band. That can work because there's a small number of earth stations in this frequency band in Europe. There's something like 15 in France. Of course, there are some adjacent band issues which will be looked at within CEPT. First, the radio altimeter. We are speaking quite a lot about radio altimeter in this time. Also, the issue of synchronization with the MFCN network, with the mobile network operators below 3.8 gigahertz. This synchronization is already something which is under consideration in countries like Sweden and Germany, where you have MNOs and verticals below 2.8 gigahertz. And one example of kind of conditions which could be applicable here are clearly what has been implemented by Ofcom in the UK with low power and medium power class of stations and of operation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Eric, for these insights on what's happening in France. Let's move on to our next panelist, Jonas Wessel, who's a director at the Resource Management Department, including Spectrum, at the Swedish regulator PTS. Jonas.
Thank you very much, Søren, and happy to be here and delighted to be back at the European 5G conference. So thank you very much Forum Europe for that. In my introductory remark, I will give a brief presentation of what Søren referred to as a natural laboratory. So I won't claim it to be the best case, or rather a case or an example of how to do local licensing to get access to the spectrum on a non-national, non-monolithic way. I will also try to stay away from the European discussion at this time and leave that for our panel discussion coming after our initial remarks. So a bit of background. We concluded our auction on the national level in the 3.5 and 2.3 gigahertz band approximately a year ago in January, and we're seeing good rollout and coverage increasing and investments being made in that market. So very happy with that. But in that process, we said that let's take a part of that spectrum and do something else with. There is other demand. So we actually saved a part for local licenses. And just a bit of extreme backstory, from 2003, we actually had both municipal and regional licenses in 3.5 for WiMAX and the likes. And as we all know who remember those times, it was, I wouldn't say an utter and complete failure, but it didn't have the market success we wanted. But we're at it again. So next slide, please. Our rationale for what we've been doing is really to see how can we, in a country like Sweden, as you see, this is the population density of Sweden, and the red parts are very few, and the higher up you go in spectrum, the less used that spectrum is in blue and white areas. So we see that there is a huge potential for some sort of sharing. And our overarching goal for our spectrum management in Sweden is to maximize societal value of radio spectrum in Sweden over time. So when we see that there is interest in other types of access to spectrum than through operators, we're interested in that. We also saw the need to lower entry barriers to harmonize spectrum, since there are, in some cases, major hurdles to get access to spectrum. So we've seen a demand in the market for non-national licenses, discussions on sharings, discussions also on verticals, which is, I have somewhat a problem with that word, but it refers to users of radio that are non-individuals or private persons, industries, etc. That's fine. We also saw a potential to increase competition by enabling opportunities to establish own private networks. If you are to use radio in your factory, you might not want an operator between your equipment and your offices. You might be having trade secrets, etc. in that. Also, we wanted to promote innovation by creating opportunities for new business models which are unknown as of yet. So next slide, please. We did a bit of consideration, and by November of last year, we opened up for applications for local licenses in the upper part of the 3.5 band and in the 26 gigahertz band. So we open up 40 megahertz in 3.5 and 850 megahertz in 26. And they are limited in geography, property-based, as you can see on the right. This is actually the old PTS office block in Stockholm, which is one example. So you're really asking and applying for a license for a property, but it's open for all to apply for this type of licenses. So it is not a set aside for a specific type of users. And yes, operators can also apply for these. We set up as simple as possible technical conditions, which is quite a number of pages of tables and graphs, etc., which is always somewhat complicated. But it's TDD, 38 dBm for 3.5 band, 23 dBm per 200 megahertz GRP per cell in 26. And there's also an edge limit on the boundary of your geographic area. The licenses are 5 years, but will potentially be prolonged by another 5 years, quite simply. Fees are really low. It is just an administrative fee for handling the license, so no incentive fee or anything like that. So approximately 50 euros per 10 megahertz in 3.5 and 25 euros per 50 megahertz in 26. We give them out. There is a application form on our website in chunks of 10 megahertz in 3.5 and chunks of 50 megahertz in 26. So you can apply for up to 40 megahertz. And as you may see, we only open up 40 megahertz in 3.5 as of yet. We will see if there are demands for much more than that. We will reconsider. And if, well, we'll come to that when it comes to where we're standing at the moment. Of course, there are geographical restrictions in some cases. And our balance in this setting up of these licenses was to have a stable situation enough to make these licenses attractive enough to avoid an auction situation where you have hoarding and not make them small or uninteresting enough so no one wants them. So one of the remedies for that was to include a use it or lose it clause in the license conditions. So it says that within 6 months after application or after award, you need to have a radio station in operation. And of course, there's a bunch more in fine print, and the license conditions are available on our website if you're interested to have a closer look at that. Next slide, please. But there are also other developments and options if you want to get hands on spectrum or use it in a vertical dimension or for industrial use. As always, we have subleasing available for all licenses. There's also a DSA clause in all our block assigned licenses, making secondary licenses potential. We also have a generous test and trial setup, and during the 5G pre-commercial period, we had approximately 25 licenses for 5G test and trials, which we see as phenomenally interesting. And also, without going into detail, as Eric described, there is potential in 38242, and we're very interested in that. So to date, was there a long queue outside the PTS to get their hands on local licenses in this band? No. We've had a handful plus of applications with a focus in 3.5 and a few applications in the millimeter waves. But we see this as an interesting way of lowering entry barriers. We also see moves in the market where the operators are all of a sudden packaging industrial and private network offerings to industry. And also worth mentioning is that in this thing, there is also a big discussion on numbers. Since you're not going into harmonized IMT technologies, etc., you need MNC codes, etc. So that's a whole other area of limited resources that needs considering. So with that, I'll conclude my initial remark and get back in the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonas. Very interesting. Our next panelist, Dave Wright, Head of Global Wireless Policy at Hewlett-Packard. Special thanks to Dave. He's based in Washington, D.C., so thanks for getting up very early. Dave?
Yes, thanks, Soren, and thanks to Forum Global as well. Good to be back with you. As Soren said, it's a bit early here on the East Coast of the U.S., but and I wish I was in Brussels with you all so I could shake some hands and see some old friends, but nevertheless, I'm glad to be here. I would just note I'm actually with Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. We're actually a distinct company and separate from Hewlett-Packard, so don't ask me about your printer issues. I really can't help you. I'm sorry. I thought I would just mention very briefly, in addition to my capacity with Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, I also happen to be the president of the OnGo Ongo Alliance, which is looking at 3GPP technologies in shared spectrum, which would include locally licensed. But I'm speaking today on behalf of HPE. So next slide, please, Dan. So as we're talking about enterprise, the future of enterprise connectivity, I think it's worth just sort of starting off acknowledging the fact that there's a variety of wireless offerings that are of interest to today's and tomorrow's enterprises. This isn't an exhaustive list, but I think it's some of the leading technologies, again, of interest to an enterprise CIO. I've highlighted in a darker color the arrows pointing next to private LTE 5G, as well as the Wi-Fi block at the bottom. And I don't think it's probably any surprise that those are the wireless technologies that we believe will be of greatest interest to, again, the enterprise CIO going forward. I'd also acknowledge, while we've put a few different classifications here on the screen, there's certainly other columns that could and probably should be added. So, in addition to range, you could put things around mobility and handoff. You could put things around client battery life. So again, there are other columns that we could look at. The thesis that I'm trying to put forward is that really in an increasingly wireless world, we need all of these technologies, and the enterprises will really need a mix of these technologies as well for different use cases. We think that they are complementary. We think that private 5G is a complement to Wi-Fi. The future for Wi-Fi is very bright, as Eric alluded to, with the 6 gigahertz band being open for unlicensed use, not only in Europe, but really globally. The outlook is good, but private LTE, private 5G really brings some new capabilities to the enterprise. Next slide, please. Looking at some of the leading verticals, and I'll agree with Jonas right off the bat. I have some issues with the terminology that we use. It's very imprecise here, but we're going to use verticals for now. Looking at some of the leading ones for private deployments, and we've listed a number of these. I would, at a high level, just say that I group these into true enterprise, and within enterprise you'd have healthcare and hospitality, retail, higher ed, the government sector as well. And so enterprise on one side, and then industrial. I kind of separate industrial from enterprise, and within industrial you'd have logistics, manufacturing. Again, we've listed some of the leading ones. It's not exhaustive. You'd also have things like the oil and gas sector under industrial, financial services as an example, potentially under enterprise. I think the logical question is, who delivers a private LTE or a private 5G solution in response to a business challenge that's occurring in one of these vertical segments? We certainly believe there's a role for the mobile operator community. They have deep expertise with LTE. They have deep expertise with 5G. So they're certainly well positioned from a technology perspective to deliver a solution. They probably have some level of expertise in a few different vertical segments. I think about the Vodafone's experience with the German auto manufacturing sector, or Telstra's experience in mining. Here in the U.S., AT&T has a whole practice around managed wireless services for the hospitality sector. So I think the MNOs will play a role in delivering this, but I do also think it's broader. I think there are a number of Wi-Fi as well as DAS solutions integrators who really focus in on these different vertical segments. So I think there's a role for them to bring, again, private LTE, private 5G solutions to the verticals. There's a sort of separate but related topic around just, what does an enterprise need in order to really be able to accept and consume and deploy and then operate an LTE or a 5G network. So I think, making a cellular network operate in a enterprise friendly mode is going to be very important. And that's really been a huge focus for Hewlett Packard Enterprise and Aruba, is integrating with the enterprise way of managing wireless networks. Almost every enterprise has a managed Wi-Fi network. So making an LTE or a 5G deployment work in a similar way or as an extension to the Wi-Fi network is going to be important. It's probably worth mentioning that the vast majority of the private activity today is really occurring with LTE, but we expect that to shift relatively quickly to 5G as more of the 5G client ecosystem evolves, particularly for SA clients. Next slide, please. I guess going back to Soren's natural laboratory, I thought it was worth talking about the ecosystem, right? So an ecosystem is like a lab environment. And I wanted to use the, I'll be happy to refer to CBRS as much as people would like. We're talking about Europe here. There may be a few things that we can look at from the CBRS example. But from a ecosystem perspective, you're really looking for a vibrant ecosystem. And I think Eric made the point early that international harmonization is key, and I would agree with that. And it's really because we started out with sort of the 3.4 to 3.8 range that in CBRS we now have 316 different models of devices, and you can look at the range of form factors here. It's really a reflection of the use cases. I would say having the mobile operators involved with a mobile broadband opportunity has really created, the economies of scale that we're looking for to get this into more devices. Next slide, please. Looking at the opportunities for international or even global cooperation, as the session talked about, I think I want to focus in on the mid-bands, focus in on the red blocks on the slide. So mid-band really is the Goldilocks spectrum for the enterprise, good mix of capacity with coverage. And I think what we're really seeing is a tremendous amount of activity now in the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz range. Certainly in Europe, Eric talked about the 3.8 to 4.2 mandate from the EC to CEPT. The broader N77 range is really a hotbed of activity, not just in Europe, but also in South America. And then just below that with CBRS, obviously in the US. And then the 4.6 to 4.9 range is really emerging quickly in Asia, with Japan and South Korea looking at N79 for private deployments. And then I just want to conclude with this one point on the next slide, please, Dan. As we talk about private 5G, private LTE, while that's important, it's also very important to just think about the in-building problems that we're going to have with coverage going forward if we're relying upon outdoor macro networks to provide that coverage. So as we go to the mid-bands for capacity and coverage, particularly for capacity with 5G, it requires higher order modulation to reach those speeds, and we're going to have some issues. So if we're going to be deploying all of these in-building networks for enterprise and private uses, I think it's important for the regulators to leave the door open to the idea that the operators could leverage those in-building deployments to support their subscribers via neutral host arrangements. So look forward to maybe discussing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dave. Our next panelist is Antonio Franchi, who's head of the 5G and 6G strategic program at the European Space Agency. Antonio, please.
Thank you very much, Soren. Good morning, everybody. And good morning, Europe. I hope you're well wherever you are and enjoying the conference so far. So I'm from the European Space Agency, and I'd like to bring here a little bit of a complementary different perspective, follow up from Dave's comment before about the use of space in providing 5G connectivity. And the session is about powering enterprise of the future to serve connectivity needs. And in this context, I would like to define 5G as the connectivity fabric which enable the digitalization of industry and society. In order to allow this digitalization, and we need 5G to be seamless, ubiquitous, and resilient. And for this reason, at ESA, we have set up a new program which is called Space for 5G and 6G. In order for 5G to be seamless, meaning that there is supposed to be a smooth switch over a smooth transition between 5G from country to country, or perhaps from vertical to vertical, or from terminal to terminal. So it needs to be seamless. It also needs to be ubiquitous. We need a connected Europe, a connected planet, in order to enable the enterprises of the future, most of which are actually global by definition. And besides ubiquitous, need to be resilient and secure as well, in order to transport the critical amount of data and the sensitive amount of data for which many of the vertical markets we've been hearing so far need security and resilience. So we believe in this context, in order to connect the planet and connect Europe, space and satellite telecommunications in integrated and complementary way to terrestrial 5G and 6G can offer a lot of solutions. And these are the Space for 5G and 6G program is designed to support European and Canadian industry, especially the space sector, in developing compelling solutions which are technically feasible and economically, commercially viable to provide this essential attribute, to help provide these essential attributes of seamless, ubiquitous, and resilient connectivity. In order to do that, we like to talk about 3D or space networks to add a third dimension to the terrestrial 5G and beyond connectivity with space added value. More and more, we hear in talking from 5G to beyond 5G and 6G, the importance of space network in a complementary fashion to terrestrial networks. In terms of vertical, at the session we talk about vertical markets and vertical segments. Space can add a lot of value and connectivity to a lot of the main 5G vertical markets. First and foremost, perhaps, is transport, transport and logistics. Transport in all exceptions, like terrestrial transport, we're talking about connected autonomous vehicles, or connected electric vehicles, and serving the connectivity to the electric grid, management to support the electric vehicle markets, and anything to do with terrestrial transport, like high-speed trains, for example, a new form of terrestrial communications. On maritime transport, we talk about support to maritime autonomous ships and these progressive trends towards autonomy of transport, whether it's land, sea, or air. We talk about UAVs or UAM, unmanned air vehicles, unmanned air mobility management. That's where the ubiquitous and resiliency is very important in complementary fashion between terrestrial and satellite use. Other sector equally important, public safety is a very important sector as well for space and for us. But perhaps besides the obvious transport and public safety, the emerging global trend is digitalization of the healthcare system and the decentralization of the healthcare system. In order to support this, obviously 5G and 6G connectivity is very important, but also it's important to serve rural and remote areas, areas where the density of population does not grant deployment of terrestrial 5G and 6G, and here an effective hybrid complementary solution can offer a lot of solutions. Just very briefly, in terms of technology, the space technology has moved on significantly from the initial geostationary satellite. We now have global constellation of satellites in orbit, in various different orbit, geostationary, low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, and all kinds of different orbits as well, ranging from very large satellites to the mini satellites, the CubeSat satellite, which is just order of a shoebox type of satellites, which can provide significant augmentation of services for Internet of Things, and for example, or data relay or live data. A lot of the trends in 5G towards 6G is moving towards sensing networks. And I'd just like to remind that a majority of sensors are actually in space, and the satellite and space is already providing a lot of the augmentary services that 5G and beyond relies on. There is a strong economic benefit to use satellite as well. Of course, I don't need to teach this community the $1 trillion 5G economy in the next decade, which is going to unveil. But of this $1 trillion, a significant contribution is due to the use of satellite and complementary use of satellite in terrestrial systems. I guess just to leave some food for thought, the technology advances in satellite is enormous. Things like edge computing, optimization of frequency deployment thanks to artificial intelligence, optimum use of terrestrial and satellite frequency, as mentioned already before, is something which is today feasible. We are supporting a lot of the deployment and development, technology development, to help maximize the overall spectrum efficiency, deployment, optimum deployment of satellite frequencies in conjunction with terrestrial frequencies. And we like to keep supporting the European telecom industry to bring closer together the mobile network operators ecosystem and the satellite network operator ecosystem to drive together, to drive with Europe towards 6G and an IoT connected Europe and connected planet. So if you'd like to hear more, please contact us at this program, European Space Agency, Space for 5G and 6G. We have one inbox, which is very simple. It's 5G, the digit 5, the letter G, 5G, @esa.int. We'd be happy to provide more information and explain how we support technically and financially Europe in continue to be at the forefront of deployment of 5G and 6G systems. Thanks also to the complementary use of space networks. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to join the panel with my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Antonio. In the interest of time, let's move swiftly to the next panelist. We already have a lot of questions from the audience. Thank you for that. So our last speaker is Luigi Ardito, Senior Director of Government Affairs, Europe and Middle East at Qualcomm. Luigi?
Thank you, Soren. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. And what I will be touching upon today is the 5G connectivity in the context of the Industrial Revolution and how this is really helping it. I will also focus on how millimeter wave spectrum can help, in terms of development of private networks. We have seen Rick speaking about it. There is a clear demand for millimeter wave spectrum by verticals. But let's get started. And next slide, please. Let me put a little bit more of a context of where we are with 5G in terms of commercialization around the world. We have seen that there are over 60 countries which are now, have 5G. There are over 150 mobile operators which are actually having commercial services, and about 500 million 5G handsets which have been shipped globally. The spectrum which is being utilized across the world is the sub-6 GHz spectrum, but also in the last 12 to 18 months, millimeter wave spectrum is starting to be utilized more and more across the world. Europe also is starting. It has been lagging behind so far, but looks like with regulators making available spectrum or announcing to make available spectrum, of course, some of the players are also starting thinking about deploying millimeter wave 5G into millimeter wave spectrum. Next slide, please. So, but let's focus now on really the value of the private network and enterprise market. So you can see that from some studies done, this can account by 2026 to more than $3.5 billion. So it's a huge number. And really, there are a wide range of industries which are affected. We are talking about, industries ranging from manufacturing to venues, enterprises, seaports, hospitality, warehousing, etc. So it's really an important trend. It is really an important market which will have a compound annual growth rate of about 18%. So a big number. Next slide, please. And at Qualcomm, we really do believe into the 5G private networks. There are at the moment early commercial deployments which are taking momentum. And there is a number of activities which we are doing globally, but also are happening also without us globally in terms of private networks. So you can see I have listed there a few of them from the activities General Motors, Toyota, Ford, Deutsche Telekom in France, Hub One in France. We have the first private network millimeter wave enabled factory in Taiwan. And we also have some important developments in China. And of course, this is an activity where not only private networks run by players which are non-MNO, but also MNOs are also playing into that space. Next slide, please. So all the activities which I have shown you before are using spectrum. Some of that spectrum which is being utilized is millimeter wave. And we have heard from Eric before, there is a clear demand, at least in Europe, for using millimeter wave spectrum for vertical industries. It can go, this spectrum to be used beyond application for smartphone or laptops. It can be utilized for indoor enterprises, for indoor and outdoor venues, and also in transportation hubs. And there are a few activities ongoing in terms of trials in Europe. Next slide, please. So basically what at the moment we have done is we have also seen and commissioned together with Ericsson a study to analysis mason to understand what would be the benefit of having 5G millimeter wave, in particular the 26 gigahertz, utilized for a number of use cases. And there is a huge value in doing that. And you can see from the slide that smart factories have an important role to play in terms of benefit, 75.8 billion in terms of benefit, coming from smart factories using millimeter wave. And there are also other use cases like airport, stadium, urban suburban location ports, and with some benefit cost ratio which range from 5 to 20. Next slide, please. So when looking at how to award this millimeter wave spectrum, we have seen across Europe different regulators having different experiences, ranging from the Finnish model, making available spectrum for private networks at the bottom of the band, 850 megahertz, and then providing national licenses to mobile network operators, to different model like the German one or the Italian, where actually, German, it is on a local basis, making available the spectrum. Italian, having some access, obligation, enabling vertical business there. So our take of what is happening, and given the different spectrum needs basically of verticals, is really that no one size fits all. For sure, harmonization, and not only in this band, but also in other band can help. At the same time, also we need to be careful about, providing dedicated spectrum, to verticals. I mean, that can be done. It's an option. It's a valid option, but really depends on the context of the market. And so basically there must be a balance, and this balance could depend very much on the country where this is happening. There might be different kind of enterprises, different sizes, different needs. So with this, I would like to conclude my presentation, and then I'm there for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luigi. So just like a quick comment on, sort of collectively all of these, presentations. I think pretty much all of you either said directly or indirectly alluded to something like harmonization is key. Multiple of you had it, even on the slide. So my question sort of upfront would be, where do we even start? Because to me, the difficulty here is that we're talking about such different use cases and it's localized. And then to me also the bigger question is, we're also talking about multiple different bands. And I think that part explains some of the the different approaches. For example, Jonas, you mentioned in Sweden you have a set aside spectrum in core mobile bands 2.3 and 3.5, but there's also lots of talk about other bands, millimeter wave spectrum and 3.8 to 4, where you don't have that interplay with mobile. So my question would be, if we need to get somewhere with harmonization, where do we start? And my presumption would be something like agreeing on which bands this vertical business should happen in would perhaps be a place to start. So if you could quickly comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's if I can start. We need to start by some frequency band in which we can get some harmonization. There was few countries like Sweden, Germany, which have taken part of the 3438 for verticals, and that was giving a trend, but it's a limited minority number of countries in Europe. And there's a new area which is 3842, and I think everybody here mentioning this frequency band have insisted on the importance of the work in this frequency band to get the harmonization that you are mentioning, and which is important for device issues.
I might continue on that. The word harmonize is a difficult word with multiple meanings. If you talk about harmonization on the European level, it's on a technical level. When it comes to how to award spectrum, that's actually national competence. So whether you should do it on a local level, on national level, the size of the block, etc. So harmonization is a technical measure to most degrees, unless when it comes to license exemption, etc. There are things like that. And I think that you alluded to it in your introduction, Soren. It is a bit of a laboratory because we don't know the solution to it. In relation to what Eric says, I know that, well, 3842, it's very interesting for sharing with other incumbent services. So local licenses would probably be phenomenally good to have there. We don't have the technical harmonization in that band yet. So in able to open that up, we open up for local licensing. So I think we need to be careful what we talk about when we talk about harmonization. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just kind of go back to the slide that I showed with the multi-band enterprise of the future. I think, yeah, N77, N79 are the two bands which really seem to be emerging, largely globally for private/enterprise type deployments and allocations. I think if you have N77, you've got N48, which is the CBRS band. You've got the subsets that cover 3.7 to 3.8. And again, there's obviously different filtering, band edge requirements, etc. But if it's in the baseband, then it's not rocket science to implement it. So I think there was a question about N79 in Asia as well. So I mean, I mentioned the 4.6 to 4.9 seems to be emerging. And so I think that's the other one that we should be paying attention to globally. But I commend RSPG for their exploratory work, and now the European Commission for the mandate. I really look forward to the CEPT work on 3.8 to 4.2. I can't overstate how important I think that is for the region.
So maybe I can comment also further, Soren. So I do agree actually with the comments from Jonas about the technical harmonization and then what the different countries actually can do. What would be, in my personal view, important, especially when looking at the millimeter wave market, to also have some kind of agreement between the member states where to position the verticals, because we have seen already some clear trend from Sweden, but also from the Nordic in general, like Denmark, Finland, to position them at the bottom of the 26 gigahertz band. So we are now in the process also probably in Spain of deciding if that portion of the band, so the lower part with the 850 megahertz, is made available for verticals, then that would also help, I believe, these businesses and also the take up and also the way we serve the business. Then that assuming also that all the European countries make available spectrum at millimeter wave, because we are likely behind really there in Europe. I mean, we have Spain and Portugal, coming on board this year, but we are still waiting for France. This is a clear message for Eric, and we are also, waiting for places like the UK, where actually more needs to be done. And this will also, drive chipset development. We are relying today, especially, on what has been done outside of Europe in terms of chipset development and key driver. So we should not be surprised that then vertical businesses don't get, access to, chipset or devices if that doesn't happen.
Thank you very much. Let's move to some questions from the audience as well. And, no particular order, let me pick one of them. So we have a question it's basically on, this continued use of a mix of auctions for some part of the spectrum and also first come, first served methods. And I think this becomes very clear, in this case, because we got such different uses that, verticals can't be expected to participate and be successful in a spectrum auction where nationwide mobile operators are participating. Dave, I know you wanted to comment on that, but to me, this is related to this question of, what is the interplay between verticals and mobile operators?
Right. Well, I wanted to just sort of, lead off saying, I think at a, philosophical or foundational principle level, you cannot argue with the value that treasuries and governments around the world have received from spectrum auctions at the national level. $82 billion in the U.S. for the C-band spectrum. That is obvious, but I don't think we also should undervalue other forms of spectrum allocations, right? So what is the value of the unlicensed and Wi-Fi ecosystem in each of the countries represented here at this conference? I would posit it's in the billions, hundreds of billions, probably for just about every member of the European Union. So that's a first thought. But in terms of, should we be auctioning spectrum or should we be allocating it, in different ways for verticals or local uses? I just want to loop back to what Eric led off with when he was talking about 3.8 to 4.2 and the work that's going on there. And the fundamental presupposition was that we will share that spectrum with the existing satellite users, right? So I think, right off the bat, that sort of precludes the idea that you're going to be able to do, national level licensing if you're sharing around incumbent operations. So, in those bands where you're going to be sharing, probably at lower and medium powers, which I think both Eric and Jonas had alluded to, then, the idea of allocating that spectrum for localized uses for, verticals, enterprises, industrials, I think that makes a lot of sense. So that's just a few thoughts.
Thank you very much. If I can just throw in kind of a related comment or question on that. So I find this idea of, we call it neutral host model, particularly interesting. So, particularly what I'm thinking about is, I know what the Danish regulator did was they had a spectrum auction where mobile operators could bid for 5G spectrum in 3.5 band, but part of that spectrum came with an obligation to host verticals if they came knocking on your door. So, that's obviously a different solution where, it's almost like you're making the vertical non-vertical by introducing this, neutral host model. So maybe that's part of the solution. We have a number of other questions, and I think we covered some of them. There was a question on, is the view on 4.8, 4.9 gigahertz for vertical use similar to Japan? I think we covered that. Or Eric, did you want to say more on that?
Well, yeah, this frequency band is really, in fact, harmonized already in Europe in some extent for national security, law enforcement, and that kind of operation also need, interoperability and harmonization of spectrum. That frequency band is part of a WRC 23 agenda item, the agenda item 1.1, and the European position is clear here. It's really to, and like the United States, by the way, it's really to oppose to any constraint in these frequency bands, in particular for the productions of aircraft and ships, which are using also this frequency band all around the world in international airspace and water. Also, I mean, we have discussed harmonization. So we see harmonization. There are some reference already, or some use of 3.7, 3.8, or 3.5 gigahertz in general. We have 3.842. That's where we have harmonization. I think we need to try to find something here, rather than starting to pick up some frequency band in all the spectrums and creating more difficulties. And sorry for this response.
Thank you. We have another question also on specifically on Sweden. I don't want to pick on you, Jonas, again, but the efficiency of use of that spectrum you set aside, because I remember you alluded to the fact that you had not had a ton of verticals knocking on your door. So a quick comment on that, if you like.
Well, the eternal question, what is efficient use of spectrum? As a regulator, it is when spectrum is being used. And if you look at the map I had up, that corresponds to the population density. That also corresponds to the spectrum usage in Sweden in upper and mid band. So we've had a handful of applications in this band, and to me, that's good. There was not a long queue, so we hadn't built up a market failure situation where we didn't supply spectrum for that type of use. We have seen a trickle. It's not massive, but I think it's also interesting to see that we are in discussions with quite a number of different interested parties in seeing, what happens when we replace our old DECT system in our office block? Is this a solution? Is this a solution in relation to a neutral host? Is this in relation to an operator managed network that is private? So I think this opens up an opportunity rather than prescribing a business model. And I think that we're still sort of, let's see, we're 2 months into the use. And I think that 2 months after we had our 5G auction in 3.5, there wasn't much use in the band either. So the jury's still out on that. I'm hoping for it to be a major success, but over time we'll see. Thank you.
Yeah, and a quick comment on that. I think in Germany, they also have this first come first served sort of register, and it's been a while since I checked it. But last time I checked, there was actually quite a lot of demand coming, and they were some years ahead of I think Sweden with their award. We also
Søren, just to mention that in Germany, this is a set aside for industry. In Sweden, they're open for all to apply to. So it's a very much more open approach. Yeah. So it's not a vertical set aside.
Yes.
Go on. I was just going to mention, if I could, I think, again, I'm going to try not to talk too much about CBRS, but I think the GAA tier of CBRS is an interesting thing to just for regulators to consider, because the very low barriers to entry at the GAA tier, where it's licensed by rule, and essentially you just enter into service with a SAS and you can access the spectrum at the GAA tier. We now have 200,000 base stations deployed in the band. So there are ways to do it without having to go through an administrative process as well.
Thank you. We have a couple of slightly more technical questions, and I'm certainly not a technical expert, so I'm happy to pass this on to the panel. There was a particularly question on when will devices or chips be ready for 28 gigahertz. So this kind of spills over to this question of which bands are we actually talking about, and do we need to park this in mobile bands, or could use millimeter wave for this? So maybe Luigi,
Yeah, I wonder if the question is 28 or 26 because the 28 gigahertz is not available in Europe. I think they meant 26 gigahertz, and this is just the discussion we were having before. Chipset are available. I mean, Qualcomm is making chipset. I mean, the device is a different story because the devices they need to see a market, and the market needs to see some players demanding it, so means some spectrum being made available, and if spectrum is not made available, there could not be a demand for that part of the market. So really, I mean, it's going back. Regulators, please make available spectrum, chipsets are there, and then we can make, close the loop and having the devices as well. This is not Qualcomm making the devices, but other companies.
Thank you. We have I think a final question we haven't touched on, which has been passed on to us here on different frame structures. I'm not an expert on that. If any of you on the panel are, feel free to pick up on this.
Yeah, I mean, from French side, we have some feedback from verticals, and very clearly, some verticals have a different need, which means for much more uplink transmission, sometimes half between uplink and downlink, or even more uplink than downlink. It's something which is a trend. We have to, so that's something we will try to accommodate. We have to be careful about the issue of synchronization, and that's something maybe where Jonas could explain the situation in Sweden, because then you may create in adjacent bands some kind of difficulty of coexistence. Just one element to pick up from the previous question, 28 gigahertz, it's something which is very important for verticals, but for the global connectivity, which was mentioned by Antonio as a different part of the vertical need, 28 gigahertz is important for that. So that's why 26 gigahertz is harmonized in Europe for the territorial one.
Thank you. I'll jump in on that. And I will not claim to be an expert on frame structures for LTE and New radio and how they correspond to each other. But and that's what I meant with that there is a bunch of fine print in our license conditions that has to do with, among other things, the frame structure, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's important to open up and lower entry barriers. So if you look at our licenses in 26, they're actually for indoor use, and that enables a non-synchronized use. But of course, there are license conditions to that. But I think it's really, really interesting to see how to accommodate different demands in the market without creating too much restrictions. Thank you.
If I could just comment quickly, I'll just put in a quick plug for the work of the ONGO Alliance, because we have a whole coexistence effort within ONGO looking at how to optimize LTE operation and 5G operation now in shared spectrum bands. And it does touch upon TDD configuration options. How do you agree on a TDD configuration amongst a common set of users if they are going to interact with one another due to proximity or power levels? So it's an important issue, and industry is taking this up. It's, again, part of the laboratory process you alluded to.
Thank you very much. I think we are almost out of time. We have a couple of minutes if anyone wants to add some final remarks. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. It's a very interesting topic. I think that will continue to evolve, and I wonder what the discussion on verticals will be in the 5G conference 3 years from now. Any thoughts, final thoughts before we close this session?
Well, maybe one final talk. We have spoken quite a lot about this local need for verticals, and maybe we will speak also quite a lot next time with the global need for verticals, and that was a part of Antonio.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Eric. I think it's important to maintain this European and global context in all these topics. And I think the combination of the new technologies, harmonization that mentioned by everyone, and perhaps the convergence in order to create the economies of scale to build the chipset that Luigi was mentioning. These are all factors which are going to influence it. Perhaps was not being mentioned that this, whether it's an operator task or whether it's a vertical task, maybe there is a place in the value chain for a new player to come in and harmonize the use of spectrum, which is either closer to the operator, closer to the vertical, depending on the specific context, but perhaps with a global or at least European context to better serve the need of the vertical. Doesn't mean there needs to be a vertical stakeholder to apply for the license, but there needs to be perhaps a new player in the value chain which keep the interests both of the operators and on the vertical by complying with national and international regulators. I know you are all the expert in this, but if anything, I would advocate this at least European, if not global approach to spectrum, where there are different frequencies, different ways of delivering the service. There's a terrestrial way, there's a satellite way, there are multiple frequencies available, and looking how to solve the problem, perhaps with a new player and enter into the value chain, could help to harmonize this approach. I'm not sure if anybody sympathizes with this approach. It's a bit philosophical, going back to Dave's philosophic approach, but I think this would be something which would help cross-national, cross-boundaries, and cross-technologies to serve the need of the end users.
So I was
Mike-
just
Sorry, go, Dave.
No, please.
Hang on, I need to come back. No, just catching on that, and I think just responding on a more philosophical level to what Søren said, and also a bit what Antonio said. We're really good in Europe at making monolithic spectrum harmonized. One solution, one type of user, auction it, send it out. We're also really good at doing license exemption on a wide scale through commission decision, blah, 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 CPT work, etc., etc. What we're exploring here is shared use between users, between different interested parties, local licensing, share in between, etc. So I think what we'll be talking about is not verticals, it's actually how to put spectrum into usage and sort of average out the marginal value of spectrum between auctions and license exemption and make, hopefully, spectrum less expensive in the future. That's my hope anyway. Thank you.
And if I could just jump in real quickly on that, when we talked about auctions relative to local licensing or in contrast to local licensing earlier, I just wanted to point out that, again, here I go again with CBRS. But if you look at it, if you introduce a database coordination element, then it doesn't preclude the idea of auctioning some of the spectrum rights. So we have the whole priority access tier in CBRS. The U.S. Treasury raised $4.8 billion auctioning off PAL licenses for verticals.
Yes, and I have to say also that I agree with Jonas about shared spectrum. Basically, in 3 years' time, that will be key word. And in the context not only of 5G, but we will be preparing for 6G, and shared spectrum will be key in the 6G context as well.
Thank you. We are very much out of time now, so I'm going to have to cut it short here. I want to thank all the panelists for your excellent contributions, and this was a very interesting discussion. And with that, I think we will move on to the next item in the program. Dan, back to you.
Thank you, Søren, and thank you very much for expertly moderating that session, and to echo Søren's thanks to all of our panelists as well. So, excuse me, a really interesting discussion, really interesting session, and one that we could continue, but unfortunately, as Søren says, we're out of time. But I'm sure one that we'll definitely be revisiting at a future event. So, thank you all so much. Really, really interesting session. And thank you again to everyone out there, to all of you out there, for all the questions and things that came in. I saw there was quite a bit of chat going on in the chat room and the questions as well. So thank you all for that. So now we're moving on. The next session we're going to be looking at is going to be focusing specifically on mid-band frequencies. So we're going to be looking at what we call in the 5G sweet spot, and focusing in a lot of more detail across the wide range of mid-band frequencies. That's coming up here in just around about 30 seconds or so. So we're just going to change studio and we will be straight back. So don't go anywhere, and we'll see you back here very shortly. And in the meantime, once again, thank you so much to all of our panelists, and to Søren, of course, for moderating that session. We'll be back here in 30 seconds or so. Thank you.